Welcome to the Community IT Innovators presentation on data cybersecurity at nonprofits. Today, we're going to talk specifically around a subsection of cybersecurity and keeping your data secure in all the tools that you use that store the data that is important to your organization. Hopefully, you have all taken some steps around cybersecurity at your organization in general. And if you need a refresher, we have many videos, podcasts, and articles on our website around general cybersecurity, including a nonprofit framework playbook that you can download for free. But today, I'm excited to be talking with our experts about additional steps and policies you need to take to secure data in all the tools that you use. Some you may not even have thought were at risk. Now, my name is Carolyn Woodard. I'm the Outreach Director for Community IT, and I'm the moderator today. And I'm very happy to hear from our experts. So Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, great. Thanks, Carolyn. It's great to be here in October Cybersecurity Month. My name is Matthew Eshleman, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Community IT. In my role at Community IT, I'm kind of responsible for two areas. So one is the back-end systems that we use to manage our nearly 7,000 endpoints, and also work with clients on their solutions architecture and cybersecurity planning. So, to be a part of. And I'm happy to be joined by my colleague, David Deal.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Carolyn. I'm a founding partner at Build Consulting, where I've been since 2015. And my work is as a virtual CIO for mid-sized and large nonprofits. So one of the things I focus on in that role is cybersecurity. So Build works exclusively with nonprofits, mid-sized and large nonprofits, mostly across the US, a little bit internationally. Build is passionately independent of any vendors. So although we keep close tabs on what Microsoft and Salesforce and Blackbaud and Bonterra and others are doing, we are not partners with any of them and don't receive money from any of these vendors. So we really sit on our clients' side of the fence in making technology decisions. So we do a lot of technology and data strategy work, virtual CIO work that I mentioned, and really combine deep technology experience with an appreciation for an understanding of organizational change management, which is really important for everything technology related, but also cybersecurity, because so much of cybersecurity is about behavior and policies and processes as much as it is technology.
Thanks so much, David. I'm so glad you could join us today and share your expertise. So before we begin, if you're not familiar with Community IT, I'm going to tell you a little bit about us. We are a 100% employee-owned managed services provider. We provide outsourced IT support, and we work exclusively with nonprofit organizations. And our mission is to help nonprofits accomplish their missions through the effective use of technology. We are big fans of what well-managed IT can do for your nonprofit. We serve nonprofits across the United States. We've been doing this for over 20 years. We are technology experts, and we are consistently given the MSP 501 recognition for being a top MSP, which is an honor we received again in 2023. So I would like to remind everyone that for these presentations, Community IT is also vendor agnostic. We only make recommendations to our clients and only based on their specific business needs. We never try to get a client into a product because we get an incentive or benefit from that. We do consider ourselves a best of breed IT provider. So it's our job to know the landscape, what tools are available, reputable, and widely used. And we make recommendations on that basis for our clients based on their business needs, priorities, and budget. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our learning objectives for today. At the end of the presentation today, we hope that you will understand what nonprofits need to do to secure your data, learn the common risks, learn best practices for data security, understand data governance, be familiar with cybersecurity technology, terms, and concepts. We're going to leave as much time as we can for Q&A, but you can submit your questions through the Q&A feature at any time, and I'll either break in to ask them if they're kind of timely with something our experts are talking about, or I'll save them for the end. All right, so we are going to start with a poll. So we're hoping that you can help us. This is a multiple choice question. Where do you store data? So we've got several answers here, and please answer all of them that apply. So you may have a custom database with SQL, Airtable, or other custom databases. You may store data in spreadsheets. I'm guilty of that right here. You may store data in an enterprise resource planning tool, a customer relationship management tool. Those are often also called a CRM. You may have an HR information system or HRIS. You might be storing your data in SharePoint and Google Drive. You may have a data warehouse. You may have something other completely where you're you're storing your data there, but it's a different system than the above, or it might not be applicable to you. You're either not at a nonprofit, you don't have any data, I don't know, but something else not applicable. And David, would you mind reading through the results?
Yeah, sure thing. So one of the lowest ones on the list is data warehouse, only 6% of respondents. Next lowest was ERP, enterprise resource planning system. However, I bet if you apply the ERP label to financial accounting systems, even things like QuickBooks, that would be 100%. Let's see, the next lowest was custom databases, weighing in at 30%. And some others were spreadsheets, about 2/3 of people, CRM, about 70%, HRIS, about 39%, and SharePoint, Google Drive, 82%. Presumably the others are using Box, Dropbox, something like that. And then there's also a few people weighed in for other as well.
Sorry, I think I cut that off a little bit early. Sorry about that, David.
That is all right. I think the key point here, and it's a little bit of a trick question. Like we expected most people to check most of these boxes. Like this software, most organizations have really most of these types of systems, perhaps with the exception of custom databases and data warehouse, which are a little less common these days. And the main point is data is everywhere. It's in all of these systems, and it's in a lot of other systems as well.
Which leads us into our first topic. So we wanted to give a little bit of an intro into what nonprofits need to do to secure their data and what practices should be in place in all instances, and then maybe some additional practices that should be considered for the most sensitive data. And I think, David, you also wanted to talk a little bit about, for this webinar, what, kind of what we're considering data in the systems that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think a couple of points I wanted to make at the beginning here are, if you are a cybersecurity expert, if that's your job, I'm not sure you'll get a ton from this webinar. We're really designing this webinar for people who are either IT practitioners who don't have much of a focus on cybersecurity yet, or perhaps non-IT leaders who are responsible for IT. And really our focus is on, here's some of the things you should be considering for your cybersecurity measures. We're not going very much into a deep dive into any of them. It's more of a broad scan of, here are the types of technologies, practices, processes you should be considering. Second thing I'll say is, this is primarily not about network infrastructure and securing infrastructure and devices. The idea behind this webinar was, there's something that often falls in the gap between what a nonprofit staff are responsible for and what a nonprofit's managed IT services provider or IT provider is responsible for. And we wanted to focus some on how are nonprofits coping with that and addressing that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would say that if you are a cybersecurity expert, it would make sense to follow David and Matt on LinkedIn because I'm sure you'll have a lot to talk about. But yes, for this webinar, we wanted to make sure to you make it accessible to people who need to manage this security and whatever level of security experience they have. All right, so Matt, I think you were going to ask David about some of these items.
Yeah, so Dave, I think it was a good overview to frame security about data as kind of separate and distinct from kind of the traditional view of network security and kind of file and folder level security. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of that distinction and kind of how threats to business applications, maybe a little bit different or have a different view on them than threats to your network infrastructure.
Yeah, so we've outlined a few threats that we find to business applications here. One of the most well-known is ransomware. Although I'll say most ransomware deals with file systems, your Google Drive, your SharePoint, and encrypting files of that nature. So in all likelihood, that is something that an MSP is probably helping you with. I think when we think about business applications, data corruption is one of the things that can happen both intentionally or unintentionally. For example, accidental data deletion or intentional data deletion, for example, from a departing disgruntled employee. Most of these cloud systems only retain data for 30 days. So if something gets deleted and you don't recognize it for 30 days, what recourse do you have? Other possibilities include things like an errant upload or import of data that can also corrupt data in your database or application. I think another common threat to the business applications is really that the data will be stolen. Sensitive data will be stolen. I was the victim of this myself with DC Health Exchange, had a big data breach, and that has caused all kinds of troubles. That was data being stolen, from a database, from a business application. I think that is one of the big security risks there. Something else that is really on my mind these days is AI. And AI offers some great possibilities and opportunities to all of us in different ways. But it's a tool that can be used just as easily by hackers and people who are up to no good and trying to get into your systems. So I think I think in part because of AI, the threat, and because of other reasons as well, but in part because of AI, the threat to nonprofits and cybersecurity continues to increase. Deep fakes are better. Scanning for and exploiting vulnerabilities is faster, more automated. And so really, I have a question for you here, Matt, which is, with hackers using AI, what do you think that means for the cybersecurity measures that nonprofits should take? Is this a game changer for nonprofits and their cybersecurity?
Mm-hmm. I don't know that I would go so far as saying it's a game changer, but I do think that it's just kind of another step in the ongoing, kind of efficiency improvement and focus of just kind of what it means to be a victim of cybercrime. And I use the term cybercrime intentionally because I think it's important for organizations to understand that every organization is vulnerable. Every organization has data that could be used or manipulated. And so, these attackers are using the tools that are available to automate and speed their way into kind of that financial aspect of crime. Now, I think there are certainly some organizations that may be at a higher risk for, what we call like advanced, threat actors that are really looking to get embedded in the organization and kind of see what's going on. But for the vast majority of cyber criminals, they're trying to target your systems, encrypt the data, exfiltrate data, use it as a ransom so that they can ultimately get paid. And I think, understanding that financial dimension of cybercrime is important. And yeah, I think these AI tools are only going to make it easier and faster for these exploits to come as they become more commoditized and commercialized. And so, those resources become widely available. Just as we're using AI tools to speed and automate our response, the other side is as well.
I think the other point, thank you for that, Matt. The other point I wanted to make just about, the risks to business applications is the proliferation of applications and data. It's extraordinary when we go into organizations and inventory the applications they're using or the places they're storing data. 10, 20 years ago, it was half, it was a quarter of what it is now, but it's so easy to spin up a new application now for a few users that data is everywhere. And so that creates complexity in cybersecurity because you have a vastly increased surface area for attacks. You have many more places where that data is stored and that data is vulnerable. It isn't just on servers on your network. It's across numerous cloud applications, multiple backup solutions. And so really one of the tactics for dealing with this and managing it, it's really data governance and having a data inventory. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Maybe we could look a little bit at some of the best practices here. I think, so Matt, you've started to talk just a little bit about it, but what do you consider to be kind of the things that every nonprofit should be doing? And then what are some things that nonprofits who want to have kind of a stronger cybersecurity measures, what things should they be considering?
Yeah, well, I think it's, I'll kind of dovetail into what you said in terms of starting with a data inventory. If you don't know what you have, it becomes very difficult to protect that. And so I think one of the things that we see whenever we come in and do, security assessments is just understanding how many different user accounts you still have and what systems do they have access to. And so with this proliferation of data, you can have sensitive data in systems that not maybe IT isn't aware of, or user accounts that are still active in systems that have sensitive data because the offboarding request never made it back to IT, or maybe that's a disconnected system and IT doesn't even manage access to those accounts. And so I think having that data systems inventory, understanding which users have access to which systems and which systems may require extra protection is really foundational. The other foundational element, and one of the reasons why we like single sign-on so much, is that it helps to kind of funnel down and give you a better way to manage and audit user access. So instead of trying to look at sign-in logs for 10 or 15 or 20 different systems through the use of single sign-on, you can look at that all through single pane of glass, ensuring that MFA is in place and well protected for the user, as they're entering those applications, as opposed to having single sign-on, or as opposed to having multi-factor authentication and a separate username and password for 10 or 15 or 20 different systems. So having a good sense of the applications that are in use, having a sense of which users need to have access. I think those are kind of foundational elements. I think once you go beyond that, then we're starting to look at more detailed audit and reporting controls, so that you can answer the question, who had access to what data when, and be able to have some stronger audit and reporting controls. As David mentioned previously, I think some of the most likely causes of data loss at an organization are, end user driven, either intentional or unintentional. And unless those tools and systems are put in place at the beginning, it's very hard to kind of go back and get that information out of a system. If you want to know, which user went and looked at all the donation history of, the top donors, and is that something they need to do for their job? So I think once you get these systems established, having more granular, access roles, being able to be a little bit more precise in terms of granting access, those are the things that we see being important. And then also having clear data retention requirements. So I think organizations have now gotten to a point where they understand that the data that they have is not just an asset, but it also represents a liability as well. And so, if there's not a good reason to keep, some data in your organization, it's a good practice or a good idea to develop, that data retention policy that you can say, we absorb this information and we use it, and then at some point, if we don't have a legitimate use for it, we're going to move it on, so that if and when we do get compromised, we only really have to do reporting against the organization, against the users in our system that we're actively engaged with, and not people that we may have contacted 20 years ago. And then I think the other piece around that data retention requirement is really driving into the backups and kind of the recovery piece, because I think the ransomware and encryption, I think, gets a lot of headlines, but at the end of the day, you're relying on a recovery strategy to be able to restore access to those systems, and so making sure that those systems and processes are in place. With a lot of cloud systems, there may be limitations on what you can do as a customer, and you're relying on the vendor to provide that. So having a clear understanding of what happens in these scenarios, what are the service level agreements, are very important steps. It's a different mindset from I got my data on the server and I'm going to restore that. You may be relying on vendors. And then again, there's an advent of a lot of pretty sophisticated security tools that can help run on this concept of DLP, or data loss prevention, as a way to ensure that sensitive data maybe isn't exported, or your systems are protected against people accidentally sending credit card information, or maybe social security number or birthday information for people that are in the database. So but I think it really starts rooted in some of that kind of policy and planning framework. And then that can help inform the technology solutions that you choose to implement.
We have a couple of, I'm sorry, David, if I can just jump in, there were a couple of questions in the Q&A. So if you can hold that thought. One was, can you just give us a basic explanation of third-party backups? What does that mean when you say that?
Mm-hmm. So a third-party backup would be a way to get information out of your primary system into a separate cloud. So a common example for us is an Office 365 backup of email or maybe SharePoint data. Microsoft is providing some protections of your data, but they, if something is deleted and you don't discover it for 3 months, that data might not be available to be recovered. And so having that data in a third-party system gives you a way to recover it, restore it if that's required for just general productivity, or maybe there's a legal case that requires you to have access to that data. So again, having data outside of your primary system so that you're able to get it back, because the vendor's likely not keeping it for as long as you want or think they should.
And so that's like a third-party vendor that you just do some kind of sync to regularly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay.
I think there are a couple of methods. I'll just add a little bit to that. Like really any cloud system, including CRMs, Salesforce, Dynamics, really any system you're using, out of the box, you're depending upon that vendor's backup to kind of keep it running. And for the most part, it's a lot more reliable than I would say servers used to be when they were on, nonprofits networks. But they're not perfect. Data gets deleted, files get lost, et cetera. And the vendor backups are usually only good for a relatively short period of time. And so that's why you really need to consider, like, when might a third-party backup be warranted? This is not just in the domain of really large organizations to do this. Even a small nonprofit, even if you're not using a third-party backup tool, you might, for example, periodically do a manual export from your CRM, just to have another copy of that data somewhere secure. So I did want to mention that. I think, yeah, so I'll turn it back to you, Carolyn. I think there's another question there.
Yeah, there is another question. I see, Matt, that you're answering it, but I wonder if you might also answer it live. So a little bit more about single sign-on and the size that single sign-on makes sense as a tool. I don't know if that's an easy answer or if that's a specific question. You're on mute still. Hang.
So single sign-on is a way that you can use your kind of primary identity. You're logging into Office 365 or Google Workplace, and then you can use that identity to then access other systems that have this ability to be integrated. So you don't have to have a separate username and password to access Salesforce. For example, Salesforce trusts Google to authenticate you into that system. So unfortunately, the system configuration takes kind of basically the same amount of time to set up, whether you're a 10-person organization or whether you're a 100-person organization. So it can be a little bit expensive, to justify. Again, if you're a 10-person organization, at that size, we typically see organizations using password managers, which are helpful because they give you the ability to have, strong, unique passwords for all those different applications. So, starting with a password manager is a good idea. Once you become maybe at 25 people or larger, or maybe if you have a lot of different cloud applications, then single sign-on becomes maybe a little bit easier to justify. But again, the cost is kind of the same to set it up, whether you're a 10-person organization or a 100-person organization.
No, that seems like good advice. So I think there are a lot of password managers out there, and you can get a pretty good one for what you need until you get a little bit bigger. Thank you, Matt. All right, so we have another poll that we're going to do. So at your organization, who is in charge of your cybersecurity? So this one is a single answer. So you have to choose the one that is the closest to your answer. And your response options are it's unclear or no one. And please don't be embarrassed or ashamed to click that as your answer, because we're all here for you, and you've come to the right place. You're in a webinar around cybersecurity, so you know that you need to do it. And I think a lot of people are in that same boat. The second option is the application owners. So like if you have, I don't know, Salesforce or something like that, that's owned by a staff, a role or a department, then that is where the cybersecurity for that tool would lie. The third option is a CIO, a CISO, a VCIO, or a similar title. That's the Chief Information Officer or a virtual Chief Information Officer. So someone at that, kind of a high executive level is responsible for your cybersecurity. The fourth answer is an MSP, managed services provider, or IT provider, such as community IT. So outsourced IT is in charge of your cybersecurity at your nonprofit. An MSSP is the next option. That's a managed security services provider, so specifically around security. Another option is other, and then the final option is not applicable. And Matt, would you mind reading the results?
This is great. It's always the big reveal here. So about 15% of folks said unclear or no one. So I'm glad you're here at this webinar, and maybe it'll give you some inspiration to go and follow that up. Then about a quarter of the audience says that does sit at that senior level at the CIO. So that's great. Then another 21% pushing it on to the MSP or the IT provider, and then a smaller proportion of 12% saying that they actually had a managed service or managed security services provider. Then we've got about 15% saying the application owners themselves are in charge of cybersecurity, and then kind of followed by others. So kind of all over the place in terms of where that responsibility lies within the organization, which is, I think, mirrors our experience as well.
Our experience. Yeah, I was going to say that, we often say when working with nonprofits, like you can make some generalizations, but so many nonprofits just operate in different sizes, different environments, have different technical, needs and complexity. So it's not unusual to see a wide range. And I think also we would say there's no universal, like you should always do it this way. It should always be at the C level, or it should always be at the outsourced level. So I think that's reflective for sure. But thank you so much for sharing that with us, all of you, because it really helps us, kind of see how how different it is at different organizations. And that leads us into our next topic, which is we wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into governance and training best practices and expand a little bit on that framework that we talked about briefly in the first half of the webinar, and just go a little bit deeper into what kind of policies and governance you need, and then some ideas on training. All right, so I think Matt, you had some questions for David about this.
Yeah, I think I've started to talk a little bit about, it's not just technology solutions here. So, from your perspective, having that CIO role at a lot of different organizations, what are, good examples of good data governance, and kind of how's that carried out at an organization?
Well, I think the organizations that do this the best have some policies, some statements around the data that they want to collect, because it's really easy to just keep adding over the months and years to the data you want to collect and not really using it. And so both for that reason, and also, when you think about data that you absolutely don't want to retain in your system, social security numbers, credit cards, things like that, do you have policies making it clear that that's not the type of information that you'll gather? So really, that's part of it, being clear about what data we're going to collect for what purpose, and revisiting that periodically to stop collecting things that you're not using. That is important. Being clear on retention requirements. What data are we going to keep for how long? Really don't keep all data forever. There's certain compliance requirements for how long you need to keep, financial data and some things like that. But otherwise, it probably doesn't benefit you, and probably just creates risk to keep data around for a really long time. The data inventory, of course, is something we mentioned earlier. To talk a little bit more about that, the things I look for, and this is one of those spreadsheets I'm glad to see, by the way. Where is their data stored? What data is there? At the very least, who is the business owner, the business person who's responsible for that data? What sort of backup and retention methods are in place for that data? But just being clear on that governance piece of who's responsible for it can be really helpful. And governance really includes things like user administration, or what I might call identity and access management. Who should be able to access what? Especially as an organization grows, you need to start to think about, as convenient as it is for everyone to have access to everything, you really need to start to apply some least privilege techniques to who can access what, really limiting people to the things that they need to access to be able to do their job. So role-based access controls in your programs begin to enter the picture there. But, identity and access management, I want to put in the plug for SSO, single sign-on, that you mentioned earlier. I can't tell you how much easier that makes it, both from the IT administration side, but also the end user side. When we're dealing with things like CRM adoption, just having single sign-on into your CRM, I think people would be surprised what a big difference that makes in people's inclination to use it to capture activities, for example. Plus, it's a big plus when managing cybersecurity risk, being able to get people out of systems when they leave the organization, and things like that. And then finally, I think data quality and looking at data quality is also a part of data governance. It's maybe not as much of a cybersecurity consideration, but are you keeping your data tidy? I'll bet the same organizations that are doing that are probably the same ones that have a data inventory and are paying attention to that type of thing.
Yeah, I would say I really like that. Yeah, the user administration piece, just kind of piggyback on that, the role-based access controls, kind of all of those are ways for the organization to kind of think about it, kind of put it down on paper, so to speak, and have an intentional approach so that, not everybody has access to everything. And I think, organizations have made pretty big strides in this area, at least from kind of what I've seen in terms of being intentional about and specific in terms of those access roles.
Well, continuing along the lines of things that aren't specifically about technology, I've we talked a little bit about the importance of training, and so much of cybersecurity is about the behavior of staff members. So, Matt, what is Community IT doing, and what are you seeing your clients do for cybersecurity training?
Mhm. Yeah. So again, I think from the cybersecurity perspective, most of the kind of security issues or compromises that we see are still kind of coming through email, or coming through password attacks, or kind of account compromise on the primary system. So I'll say, knock on wood, we have not yet seen a case where a database user account was compromised, but typically there's kind of an incursion through the primary system. And so going back to what are the fundamentals, having that security awareness training practice for staff to keep those topics front of mind, I think is absolutely essential. We use Nova4. I think they have a good kind of product. There's a lot of other security awareness training platforms that are out there, but I think from our perspective, we like to do a mix of kind of test phishing to kind of see how staff are performing, who's susceptible, who may need some extra education, combined with relatively short but kind of frequent training engagements. So again, our approach typically is to have quarterly trainings, just to kind of get different and new concepts in front of staff. It doesn't take a lot of time, but we really want security to be at top of mind for folks. And so that's the approach that we've taken. And I would certainly encourage other organizations to adopt that, intentional training approach. I think kind of focusing on the fundamentals of, general security awareness training, I think then you start looking at some specific training for how the application is configured and used. So, Dave, maybe you can talk maybe more specifically about some of the training resources that are available at the application level. But then just to kind of wrap up, again, I think it's really important for organizations to have some policies and procedures in place to identify, what are we gonna do as an organization when we think we have a problem? How are we gonna go about that? Who do we talk to? Who's responsible on our side? How do we interact with our stakeholders? And make sure that that is defined and tested in advance, because the common thread is it's not a question of like if you're going to have a compromise or a breach, but it's a question of when. And so being able to test and define those policies and procedures in advance of a crisis, I think, is really important, because it can give you a lot more confidence. And it may even be a requirement if you are following up on procuring cyber liability insurance. Some of those things are just expectations of those policies. So that's kind of the foundational elements that we talk about or think about when we're looking at designing an effective security awareness and security training program for an organization.
I think specifically from the business application perspective, both administrator training and end user training comes to mind. And what I mean by administrator training, really, number one, making sure that for any application you have, there is an application owner, someone who understands that by putting the organization's data in that application, they need to take responsibility with, or work with a CISO or some person who does have responsibility for the cybersecurity of that data. And they need to be looking at things for that application, like, is two-factor authentication available? Do we have it turned on? Who's using it? What do they have access to? What can they export? Getting back to this idea of data loss prevention. As I think about an HR information system, for example, how many HR people do you know who are exporting full, staff lists with salaries and or social security numbers or things like that to a spreadsheet that then sits in their OneDrive or their Google Drive, or worse, their local hard drive? So there's some end user training, I think, about, I'm not going to say there's never a business need to do an export of sensitive data, but if you're going to do it, there's certain ways to handle it to make sure that you're treating it securely and you're not leaving copies of this data sitting around everywhere. but there's no generic security training that I know of for really general use of business applications, because it really depends upon the business application. So the nonprofit itself and whoever's responsible for that application and cybersecurity for that application really need to think about, how do we need to train the administrators and the end users to be responsible with this data.
That's a great segue, I think, into our next topic on the technology involved. I know David, as Build always says, the technology usually comes last in an organization around what you're trying to do, and then you want to find the technology that will do that thing instead of choosing the technology first and doing whatever the technology says. In a topic like cybersecurity, your organization will probably have a lot of vendors reaching out, trying to sell you tools before maybe you've done an assessment around what you really need. And as we've said today, I think several times, within the tool or platform that you're using, there may be security like specific to that. So you don't need an additional tool, or you might need something like the third-party backups that we talked about today. So I wanted to use some of the time we had left to review some of the terms that nonprofit staff might come across, how some of these tools work. We have a question in Q&A, and we got a question at registration around Okta. So I'm hoping that you can touch on that and maybe some of the other tools. So go ahead. I think, Matt, this is one of your areas of expertise.
Yeah, so Okta, which is a single sign-on vendor. Okta is actually a scientific term. It's a way to measure the degree of cloud cover. So it's a very, whoever named that for your cloud single sign-on was pretty smart. But that gives you a way to easily sign on and kind of have access to all these single sign-on applications. It is what we call a third-party vendor, which would be distinct from Microsoft with their Azure or Entra ID, which is also gives you the ability to do single sign-on. Same thing with Google Workplace. You can use that as a single sign-on platform. We see, I would say, the majority of customers that we're working with are using the native tools for primarily, I would say, for cost reasons. There are some organizations that have chosen to implement third-party single sign-on solutions and identity providers. Okta is probably the biggest name, one of them, but OneLogin. There are others. My sense is that there can be some benefits with, from usability to going to the third-party providers, although that introduces some complexity and kind of yet another vendor that you need to rely on for uptime. And identity is very, very critical, because if you have an outage, then it kind of takes out access to all of your applications. And so I tend to, prefer to kind of stick with the core vendors for that reason, just because, if Okta has an outage, if OneLogin has an outage, that really has a pretty outsized impact in your access. And uptime and availability is kind of the number one kind of feature of those solutions. So, and I think both Microsoft and Google have made improvements in terms of the usability of those tools, and so I would kind of stick with the main vendors there.
Matt, I would say the two I see the most are Okta and Azure AD, or now Entra ID, and I'm sure Microsoft will change the name again next year too, right? But traditionally, my thought on the argument for Okta was both the usability side, end users found it more usable than, say, an Azure AD, and also the number of applications and the level of like how easy it was to connect with more applications. So I think that's why some organizations will, pay the not small bucks to get a third-party solution like Okta, in my experience.
Part of the question was around open source solutions as well. Do you have thoughts on that?
I am not familiar with that the company that was mentioned there in terms of kind of the open source tool. I will say that the standards that are used for SSO integration are, I guess, technically open standards. The other piece I think that was raised in another chat question was just to acknowledge that for some vendors, they make the single sign-on feature a premium add-on. So, it could be, if you have Slack as an organization, unless you've got the business version or, the upper tier, you may not be able to do single sign-on with integration with that application. I think it's something that, vendors should make free and kind of include it as a core, part of the product, because I think from a security perspective, it's so vital. But that is something to be aware of, is that to get access to the SSO feature, that may be another couple dollars a month or a different tier. And so, that's something that's, at least worth considering whenever you're looking at these different solutions.
I would just add the importance of that. Like I would really advocate for organizations to really, spend a little bit more money for increased usability and increased cybersecurity. That's probably
Mhm.
one of the better investments you can make, and a pretty solid return on that investment for usually not that much more.
Mhm.
Well, we said we would talk about terms, and we're going to run out of time in just a little bit. So I wanted to make sure to touch on some of these things. I know multi-factor authentication we've talked about elsewhere, and we have some stuff on our website about it. But Matt, you wanted to talk a little bit about authentication versus SMS. And also, I know
Hmm.
those security keys, like the actual physical key that you can use. Do you have advice on that?
Yeah, so actually, this is something that Microsoft is actually driving right now, in terms of removing the ability to use text messaging as a secondary MFA source. So multi-factor authentication combines something that which is your password, along with something you have. Microsoft now is saying, hey, the Microsoft Authenticator app on your phone would be a good option. Security keys are becoming more and more popular, and I will make a pitch for them. So it looks something like this. So there's some open standards. So FIDO security key, you may see it named as. But this is a much, kind of the best method of multi-factor authentication, because it is very hard for this to be spoofed. So we have started seeing some very, very sophisticated kind of hacking attacks or web proxy attacks that actually can steal the multi-factor authentication token from your phone. It cannot steal it from this physical key. So, for organizations that are very concerned about their identity and access management piece, I think these physical security keys are a good way to provide, a really high level of security. It also has the benefit of, you don't have to ask your staff to install an app on their phone, and kind of that raises some BYOD concerns. But again, multi-factor authentication is critical. A good solution is certainly to use the Microsoft Authenticator app for those of you in Office 365, and for, $20 or $30, you can get a physical security key, and really up your game for protecting your identity against, those kind of sophisticated attacks.
So I know we've talked a little bit about single sign-on a couple times and backups. We went over that as well, but we haven't hit as much on encryption. So can you talk a little bit more about that, Matt, about HTTPS, which I think a lot of us know, but what do nonprofits in general need to know about encryption?
Mm-hmm. I think the good news is that, encryption in transit, where a lot of these cloud solutions is already provided, right? So that's the SSL or TLS. So you see the lock in the website whenever you're accessing your Salesforce database. That means that as the data goes from your computer to their servers, that data can't be spied on by anybody else that kind of may be in the network. So those things are pretty widespread now. And if you're filling out your cyber liability insurance applications, it's easy to say yes, end-to-end encryption, or in-transit encryption is enabled. What may not be quite as apparent is encryption at rest. And so that's really talking about this idea of, when the data is saved somewhere, is that encrypted at rest? So I think for a lot of the cloud hosted systems, again, that answer is yes. But if you have a database or a web, an application that you are still hosting yourself, you need to, take extra additional steps to make sure that that data, when it's saved on the server or the computer, is encrypted. BitLocker is a term on the Windows side, or File Vault for the Mac side, that will encrypt your hard drive so that if, again, your device is lost or stolen, if somebody takes your hard drive and like tries to get data off of it, it's going to be unrecognizable. So, um, and I don't know, Dave, maybe you can provide some insight. So there are, I know, some tools within products like Salesforce that do some, again, more encryption within the database itself.
Yeah, for example, in the Salesforce world, there's Salesforce Shield that helps with everything from encryption to monitoring who's doing what in the system, and is a really helpful sort of cybersecurity tool there. I did want to ask, because I know we're running out of time, since substantially every website you go to now and is protected by, you'll see the HTTPS at the front of the website name. And every web application you're using, almost all of them are using that. Is a VPN really as necessary anymore for anything other than connecting back to a local network?
I mean, I must admit, I've never been a huge fan of kind of VPNs to provide secure internet. I think it's a good idea if you have security and privacy concerns that you should just travel with your own hotspot, and kind of rely on that for connectivity. I think VPNs do have a case. I will say, as somebody that like looks through lots and lots of security logs, VPNs can be super problematic because they, especially if it's not a corporate VPN service, like it can make you appear like you're connecting from, Oregon, and then you're connecting from Montana, and then you're connecting from New York, and then all of a sudden, like, all these rules that we have in place to look at, unusual travel or location, like, all go haywire. So VPNs, I think certainly do have a place. I think if you have an organization that says, like, we really need to provide trusted internet access, and we're going to be really defined about where we allow people to connect from, having a corporate VPN solution that allows you to do that is good. But just having a VPN to protect your internet traffic at while you're at Starbucks, maybe not as beneficial as maybe as it used to be.
And then we have one more term on this slide, the data leak or loss prevention. And I know we touched on it earlier. I kind of got the sense from you both that this was more of a policy issue. If you have more sensitive data, or maybe you're operating in a sector in which you have more privacy concerns, would you talk a little bit about DPL? Matt or Dave?
Sure. So DLP, or data loss prevention, typically described as more of like a way to provide some automated, and again, this is maybe a kind of the use of AI, right? So there are kind of systems that are built into Google and Office 365. Those are the ones I'm most familiar with, that basically can read or look through the content of your file systems and flag things that look like credit card numbers or social security numbers or a banking account or routing information, and then they can take actions. So again, a common control is to say, we're going to block anything that looks like a credit card from being sent in an email outside the organization. So again, or a social security number, right? So maybe your HR person has an export of all the staff with their social security numbers. They go hit attach on that file. The DLP rules all of a sudden will trigger and say, hey, this looks like it has sensitive information. Like, are you sure you want to send that? Or, they could block it. And again, so it's a way to provide some technology controls that can help support the policy choices that an organization has made. If they said, yes, like, we have sensitive information in our database, you can't export that and save it on your computer. You can't save it on the network. The DLP rules can help be that technology enforcement on the policy decisions of the organization.
I'll just quickly add one thing about DLP. Like, you really need to be thinking about the different ways that data might exit your system or your organization. So certainly email, but also, now we have Slack and Teams that are used for external collaboration a lot. Or maybe someone's just doing a big export from a CRM database and taking that spreadsheet with them, things like that. So there are DLP solutions built into the products, into many products that can help with this. And then there are also third-party DLP solutions to be considered if you want a more comprehensive approach to it.
Thank you guys both so much for taking us through that. I really appreciate it. So I'm actually gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna head right to our learning objectives and just recap for people. We wanted to help you understand what you need to do to secure your data at your nonprofit, learn some risks, learn some best practices, understand data governance and policies, and be familiar with cybersecurity technology terms and concepts. I think we did pretty well at that. Thank you, Matt and David. If we didn't get to every question, we did get a couple of questions at registration, so we'll try to answer those in the transcript for this webinar, so you'll be able to find that on our site. If you're watching on YouTube today, we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, so you'll get the updates every time we post a new webinar. Matt and David, I just wanted to thank you again so much for your time, sharing your experience and expertise with us today. Thank you everyone who attended the webinar, and I really appreciate it. And I'll let you go on your way for this afternoon. Thanks again.